I've had a patient famously who rode a motorbike in her sleep. Somebody, plenty of people who have gotten up and cooked in their sleep. One individual who rewired electronic gadgets in their sleep. One of the common things that we see are individuals who are accused of crimes that are alleged to have happened in their sleep. I've been involved in some cases of individuals who, for example, have murdered people apparently in their sleep, allegedly. So really quite striking stories. The full range of human activity during the day can always be reflected at night.
What's the frequency of people who do things like cook or drive in their sleep? Because this is sort of a crazy. I don't think I sleepwalk, but I don't know, I guess, if I do or not. What percentage of people sleepwalk?
Well, we know that sleepwalking is very common in childhood.
Okay.
It's part of normal development almost, but in about 1 to 2% of individuals, that persists into adulthood in the form of sleepwalking, sleep talking, sleep eating, sexual behavior, or sometimes rather rarer sorts of behaviors like, for example, driving in their sleep or sleep eating. So as a whole, this group of conditions is not that rare. I guess that, many people will occasionally sleep talk or sleepwalk, and they don't necessarily come to see somebody like myself. They live with it. It's part and parcel of who they are. But it's when it becomes problematic, either to themselves or to their partners, and at the extremes when it becomes dangerous, that they will often seek medical help.
Right. What's happening in the brain during sleepwalking?
So, at the core of many of the conditions that I see is the fact that whilst we think of the brain as being in an on-off state, that when we sleep, the brain is off, actually that's far from the truth. Firstly, actually there are stages of sleep during which the brain is highly active as it is during wake. And secondly, that the brain as a whole does not necessarily sleep as a whole, that different parts of the brain can exist in different stages of wake or sleep at the same time. And so, for example, in individuals who have these conditions like sleepwalking, which we term non-REM parasomnias, what we see is that these behaviors arise from the deepest stages of non-REM sleep. It's something called stage 3 sleep. But during these events, there is something going on that results in parts of their brain waking. And if we look at the brain either electrically or metabolically, what we see is that different areas of the brain demonstrate waking patterns. And those areas of the brain in particular that seem to be prone to waking up are the areas of the brain that are responsible for movement, for vision, and also for emotion, which is why a lot of people have things like night terrors or have a very strong emotional context to their sleepwalking events. The parts of the brain that remain in very deep sleep are in particular the frontal lobes, which are obviously the area that is responsible for rational thinking, for planning, for reasoning, which is why people do things that might not necessarily be entirely sensible in the middle of the night. And typically parts of the brain that are responsible in memory, which is why a lot of people have either no recall or very limited recall for these kinds of events.
I'm assuming that when people are sleepwalking, they're kind of orchestrating very well consolidated motor circuits behaviors that they have acted out many times, that those are just kind of very hardwired in them, so that when they're kind of acting on autopilot, you sort of go to those really consolidated circuits. That's the sort of behavior you act out. Would that be accurate?
Well, I think that there is, it has been proposed that there are sort of motor pattern generators within the brain that are triggered during these kinds of events. But, essentially there are likely going to be some sort of more primitive behaviors that manifest. But, that what your question is implying is that you will do what you are habitually
Right.
doing during the day. And, certainly we see lots of individuals who would do things in the middle of the night that they would not necessarily do during the
Really?
day.
That's
So,
so
so
interesting,
now,
isn't it?
now, now, some of that may be related to the fact that actually the frontal lobes are involved in decision making. And so, for example, one of the things that we routinely see in people who sleep eat, for example, is that they will often eat foods that are perhaps not things that they would eat during the day. So, typical example is somebody who's vegan who will find, a big pork chop in the fridge, and will cook it,
Really?
or will eat stuff that actually really shouldn't be eaten. So, for example, pet food, for example. So, now that may simply reflect the fact that actually, essentially at that point in time, your brain is not functioning normally. Essentially part of your brain is shut down. And it's very much akin to individuals who exhibit confused behavior, for example, in the aftermath of a brain injury, or when they are hypoglycemic, when a diabetic has injected too much insulin and their blood sugar goes down. The brain is not working properly as a whole.
When the decision making regions of the brain are down, does that mean that whatever foods they might decide to eat is almost random chance? Like they're probably, if they stumble up to the fridge for whatever reason and then they open it, there isn't a very complicated decision making matrix going on of pork, but I'm vegan, chocolate, but I'm on a diet, vegetables, that's how, like, that stuff might not be happening. Like, is that just random chance on kind of whatever the hand reaches out to and grasps? Like, I'm really trying to understand what behavior looks like when you're asleep and you're
Yeah.
sleepwalking.
So I think that it's important to stress that there is likely a very, very broad spectrum of brain states that underlies these kinds of phenomena. So for some people, it is likely that to a very large extent, their brain is awake, but there remain some small regions of the brain that are asleep. Whereas in other individuals, it's probably the converse. And I think that certainly, the greater the extent of sleep within the brain, probably the more primitive the behaviors are. So it's very difficult to say for as a whole what the degree of decision making is, and I think it probably varies even within the same individual.
Right. Should people be concerned if they are sleepwalking, if their partner finds them sleepwalking? Is this something to be concerned about for your health?
So I think for the vast majority of people, um, it is an inconvenience. It's not
Yes.
dangerous. Um, There are some individuals, about 50% of individuals who sleepwalk very frequently, who say that it impacts the quality of their sleep and they feel more fatigued during the day. But that
Right.
means that for 50%, it doesn't. The concern is really when you are putting yourself at risk or your partner at risk. Because, whilst violence during these kinds of events is very rare, it can happen. I have seen individuals who have ended up in court as a result of these kinds of phenomena. I've also seen people who have injured themselves terribly as a result of these kinds of episodes. So, for example, I remember seeing a young man who climbed out of a window, which was unfortunately the second floor, and fractured his pelvis and his legs as a result. So that those kinds of episodes are certainly a great cause for concern, and in that case, it's absolutely crucial that people go and see a doctor to see whether this is something that can be sorted out.
What are some of the craziest cases of sleep disorders that you've come across in your career?
So some of those are I see fairly routinely. So, individuals, for example, with narcolepsy who fall asleep in nightclubs or while standing in goal in a football match, for example.
Really?
A
That
lot,
actually once someone falling asleep.
yeah,
I'd be
well,
so mad if I was on that person's team. They literally
yep.
fell asleep in goal. Although your team is probably not doing too badly if the keeper can afford to fall asleep.
I mean, the degrees of sleepiness that we sometimes see are really quite astounding. I think a lot of the more strange and startling um, stories are related to people doing odd things at night. So, I've had a patient famously who rode a motorbike in her sleep. Somebody, plenty of people who have gotten up and cooked in their sleep. One individual who rewired electronic gadgets in their sleep. And also there are, lots of cases of individuals who have caused themselves physical harm. I remember seeing one woman who cut her throat in her sleep, although it's difficult to know whether or not that had an alternative explanation, like a psychiatric explanation. Um, One of the common things that we see are individuals who are accused of crimes that are alleged to have happened in their sleep. So things like sexual assault. Now, there is a real condition which is called sexsomnia, which is people exhibiting sexual behavior in their sleep. And, there have been some individuals in whom I'm quite convinced have this condition. The danger is always that people kind of know about these conditions and then use that as an excuse for criminal behavior. And, been involved in some cases of individuals who, for example, have murdered people apparently in their sleep, allegedly. So really quite striking stories. The full range of human activity during the day can always be reflected at night.
Right. How would you ever prove that that person was asleep in a court case? Because assumedly the whole thing had to go to court and they had to give conclusive evidence that the person was asleep during the incident. But if it was only the person and the victim, how would you ever prove that?
Yeah, so I think this is a really difficult area, and it's one of the reasons why I tend to limit my involvement to these forensic cases, because I like to see patients as my patients, rather than to speculate on, the likelihood of something happening in their sleep.
Right.
The only way of being definitive is to have had electrodes attached to that patient's scalp whilst they were accused of whilst they committed that alleged crime, and obviously that's not realistic. But but I guess it reflects the fact that in order to convict somebody, you need to be satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that they had something called mens rea, that they had the intention in their mind of doing something. And so, and ultimately that decision comes down to a jury. But certainly, if everything that happened on the night in question is very consistent with that patient being asleep at the time, if there are no features that suggest that they could not have been asleep at night, and you can demonstrate that they have a long track record of doing similar sorts of things at night, and
Right.
perhaps if the sleep study is confirmatory of the fact that they have this predisposition, then obviously that might influence a jury in terms of their view as to whether or not that patient had mens rea, had the intention to commit that act. But it is a very, very difficult, problematic area of the law.
Would you mind telling the Kenneth Parks story?
Yeah, so Kenneth Parks was a chap in Canada who famously drove several miles to his parents-in-law's house, and he stabbed his mother-in-law to death, and then I think also tried to kill his father-in-law with a tire iron. And he was acquitted on the basis that he was sleepwalking. So, which is really quite remarkable. I mean, I think it's pretty unusual for people to first of all have such prolonged periods of non-REM parasomnia, and secondly to perform quite such an organized level of activity. But clearly the medical evidence that was presented to the court was convincing enough to enable him to become acquitted.
It's astonishing, and I really want to know what that evidence could possibly be.
Yeah. I think that my understanding of the evidence was that it was very complicated, but that he very clearly had demonstrated lots and lots of sleepwalking in the years before this event, that he was under very high stress, which would have, I think, fragmented his sleep. But, it's always a difficult call.
Yeah, it's grasping at straws, it seems. Because
Well, in him, he successfully grasped at those straws, that's for
yeah, it
sure.
seems like it. Because it seems like the framework that you laid out kind of at the start in the earlier aspects of the podcast was that, some areas of the brain can be awake and some areas are asleep. And it goes into an ethics discussion if the ethical area of his brain was asleep, but all the other areas were online, if he is culpable. But do you think acquitting in that legal court case, and I know you're not a lawyer, but do you
Yeah.
think that is conducive with the neuroscience about what we know is happening in the brain?
I mean, I think it goes far beyond that. But to answer that specific question, I think that in many ways, when you are sleepwalking and there is brain dysfunction, that is no different to somebody who has committed a violent act in the aftermath of a seizure and who is confused, or
Right.
somebody who has had a significant traumatic brain injury. The dysfunction of the brain is transient, more transient in sleepwalking, but it is still representative of um, the fact that the brain is not working as it would normally do in that patient's day-to-day life.
Yes.
And so, certainly one can argue that to ascribe moral or legal responsibility to somebody whose brain is not working properly is difficult. I mean, I think that there are, when it comes to neuroscience, and actually this is the subject of my latest book, Seven Deadly Sins,
Yes.
it is very much, how much of our behavior is attributable to free will
Yes.
and how much of it is determined by the structure and the function of our brains. And I think that even beyond sleep, when you look at our actions, like aggression, like violence, like other aspects of our bad behavior, there is very good evidence that for all of us, there are factors beyond our control that influence how we behave. Now, that's most marked. I started off by saying that one of the things that I'm interested in is looking at nature's experiments and seeing what that tells us about the normal functioning of the brain. When you look at individuals with neurological disorders in general, you often see individuals in whom one can quite fairly argue that they have no free will, that their neurological disorder quite clearly has changed the structure or the function of their brain and has resulted in them performing particular acts or behaving in a particular way that one could argue is not to do with the essence of who they are. Yeah. So if you take those individuals at the extreme and you begin to look at individuals who don't have frank neurological disorders, but individuals like you and me, and you look at some of the environmental factors that influence how our brains function, then there are factors out there for all of us that will influence how we behave. And then it blurs the boundaries between the normal and the pathological, and in particular, it blurs the boundaries surrounding free will. Now, there are, of course, some neuroscientists who believe that there is no such thing as free will,
Yeah.
that actually it is entirely illusory, and that every decision that we make is entirely defined by the circuitry, by the structure, by the biochemistry in our brains. Now, I'm not sure that I come down on one side of the fence or another, but I think that what is very, very clear is that there are a lot of individuals out there in whom one can argue that they do not have entirely free will.
Fascinating. It's so interesting. And it's a huge rabbit hole that we could go down. I'm sorry we didn't get to talk about Seven Deadly Sins properly. I'm reading it at the moment, and I think it's a really, really fascinating book. How how would you, if you were consulting with lawyers and legal representatives in cases like these really complicated cases where some aspect of free will is distorted or warped in some way from some neurological incident. How ethically culpable do you think those people are? I know it's case specific, but like, how do you even wrap your head around that kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to say is it's very, very difficult. You know, I think there's also a distinction between moral responsibility and the functions of the legal system.
Right.
So, the legal system is, of course, it can be viewed as saying, well, this person is evil. They've done something evil. They need to be punished for it. Um, but perhaps if you look at it from a slightly different vantage point, which is that actually the legal system is there to protect society, then that doesn't negate the fact that punishment is an important determinant of how wider society behaves. The brain responds to reward and punishment. That is the basis of how we behave. And so, punishment for the individual or society understanding that there are punishments associated with particular behaviors is an important driver of the way that wider society behaves. The legal system also has a responsibility to protect society. And so actually, if somebody is prone to committing certain acts that are harmful to
Right.
society, then the legal system has a duty to set that person aside so they can't keep on doing the same thing.
Right.
I guess it just changes the nuance a little bit. And, perhaps we're incorrect in saying a person is good or evil. We can say that an act is good or evil. But the criminal justice system perhaps should be slightly more focused on the question of, is this person's brain fixable? Are we able to do something about the structure or the function of this person's brain in order to prevent those acts happening again and again?
Right.
But I think, as I said, there is a distinction between moral culpability and legal culpability.
Yeah. Like, I find it very hard to believe that someone who would sleepwalk, drive 20 kilometers, and bludgeon someone to death with a piece of metal wasn't quite close to doing that while conscious. Like, that must have been something that was kind of on their mind. You have
Yeah.
to assume that it was something that was on their mind, and then you also have to assume that it is surely more likely that they might do it again. They might act out on it again, even if they sleepwalk and do it again. Are they
Yeah.
likely to,
Yeah.
with an acquittance of that person? Do you know where they surely they had to undergo some psychiatric help to ensure that didn't happen again, that he didn't go on
Yeah.
another sleepwalking terrorize
Yeah, so
mission?
the British justice system does have that distinction. So it describes this phenomenon of automatism, where you do something automatically without conscious awareness of it, and it distinguishes between insane automatisms and sane automatisms. Now, the distinction is really whether or not there is an extrinsic factor that is modifiable. So, for example, if somebody committed a criminal act, if they were given an injection of insulin by a nurse and went hypoglycemic and then attacked somebody, then that is seen as an extrinsic factor. Whereas if it's intrinsic, i.e., not related to any obvious external modifiable factor, then that's in a different category, and therefore, individuals can be incarcerated in a hospital rather than a prison until they are deemed to have been fixed.
Right.
So there is that distinction there. It doesn't always quite make sense from a medical perspective. So, for example, if somebody enters into a fugue state, a psychological state that is triggered by the fact that they've been raped, then that's seen as an extrinsic factor. Whereas if it occurs in the absence of a rape, then it's seen as intrinsic. So it
Right.
doesn't quite make sense, but there at least is a template there for trying to answer some of these questions.
Yeah, like you gave the insulin example there. I mean, the much more obvious one is just alcohol, right? Isn't an obscene amount of violence and aggressive murder done
Yeah.
under the influence of alcohol? Isn't there slippery slope arguments that can be made that, oh, the person was just drinking,
Yeah. Yeah.
their decision making was inhibited, their ethical qualms were dampened.
Yeah, absolutely. And alcohol is all uh as soon as alcohol is in the mix, because it's so widely used and because largely people understand the impact of alcohol on themselves. If you choose, if you get a little bit violent or aggressive when you've been drinking alcohol and you choose to drink 20 pints,
Right.
then the law determines that you have that you have legal responsibility. It's the same with drink driving. You could argue, well, I was drunk and therefore I can't be held responsible for being uncoordinated in my driving and driving in a risky fashion. Whereas the law says, well, that you should not be drinking and driving, and therefore you have entire legal responsibility for that fact.
Right.
I really hope you enjoyed that clip with sleep expert Guy Leschner. If you did, I'm really confident you'll enjoy our full conversation. You can watch it now here.